Thanks to all of you who have gathered here today as part of this second summit here in the state of Florida looking at human trafficking. As General Bondi mentioned, this was not on our radar screens, not on many of our radar screens, at least until recent years. And it's a great testimony to what the state of Florida is doing, as well as to the leadership that is gathered here on this platform today, that we are able to address it in the way that we are. It was Abraham Lincoln who actually, a century and a half ago, said that the first and only way that you truly move a country is by establishing a common idea. And what we have today is a testimony to this common idea here in the state of Florida that we will not tolerate modern slavery. We talk about trafficking as the dark underside of globalization, and it's simply so lucrative. That's why Florida remains the #3 state in the country in terms of calls to our hotline, in terms of the number of cases that we continue to see. Both sex trafficking but also labor trafficking. As, again, Mr. Panuccio mentioned that, again, it's the dark side of our economy as well. Now, we have to address that. What we have today now is an opportunity to talk to our state leaders. Again, a great testimony to the fact that Florida is way ahead of the curve in so many ways with our legislation, but also with the kind of leadership that we have. And it's our opportunity this morning to actually pick the brains of literally this brain trust that is gathered here today. So I'd like to actually ask a number of questions, and we'll give folks the opportunity to talk about what their own agencies are doing to combat modern slavery. If we could start with Deputy Secretary Daly, what is the Department of Juvenile Justice doing to combat trafficking and to assist victims of trafficking here in Florida?
Thank you for asking that question. We have really a multifold initiative at the agency. One of the primary things that we are doing, and I think Governor Scott asked to it when he was doing his speaking points, but the victim identification pilot project that we're doing. And it's an assessment tool that we piloted in 3 of our JAC centers in Miami, Broward, and Orange counties. And it was a way for our staff to be trained. We trained them through motivational interviewing of ways to ask questions. You don't sit down and do a piece of paper and talk to a youth. It's more of a conversation and really a way to identify triggers and things that these youth have been exposed to, because only about 4% of the kids that are arrested that are trafficking victims are arrested on prostitution. Many of them are coming in for, battery, burglary, things like that. So we implemented this pilot project. We have now implemented an additional pilot project in 3 of our detention centers. To very similar assessment, but is focusing on labor trade. So we are very much looking forward to the outcomes of these assessments. We're hoping to have some analysis on the data by the first of the year, and then hopefully have an assessment to roll out statewide that all of our programs and providers and communities can use to really assess these youth, because it's so important. The way you ask the questions is almost more important than the questions that you ask. So we're very excited. And certainly the work that we do with the work group, Secretary Walters was instrumental under the Children and Youth Cabinet. She chaired the work group with them, and it has been an enormous passion of hers. And we are really focused on every element throughout our entire system to look at ways that we can identify victims and get them the right services that they need.
Great. Thank you, Deputy Secretary. And this notion that, for the most part, we're really not arresting children for prostitution, that it's actually masking charges, that it's children being picked up for vagrancy or shoplifting or a host of other criminal issues, that actually then leads us to the fact that once you scratch that surface, you may actually discover this child is actually a victim of trafficking. So a really important recognition and a great direction for our Department of Juvenile Justice to be moving. Thank you, Deputy Secretary. If we could move to the DCF world, the other side, that again, we encounter our children at times in our juvenile system, but also in our foster care and in the world of social services. What is it that DCF, what's the role that you have in combating this?
Well, our role really is to find the right interventions for the children that come into our care. And thanks to the law, now law enforcement has the option of actually calling the hotline and having, instead of an arrest, having them come into our care. So we have, since January of this year, we've had close to 700 calls for human trafficking for the hotline, most of those being for commercially sexually exploited children, about 58 or so for the labor piece of it. So we continue to look for the right interventions. They could be anything from a safe house environment to therapeutic foster placements to wraparound services in a home that perhaps a parent is willing to protect but unable to do so.
Great. And so important, too, that in recent years we've developed a code for our Florida hotline as well, that now people around the state of Florida can call in and actually identify trafficking, and that there's a recognition within our system as well
That's
that DCF has done leading work on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. If we could turn to General Bondi. In 2012, our legislature actually passed remarkable laws. They really brought our Florida law up into the 21st century in terms of going after traffickers. And a prime reason for that was General Pam Bondi, who actually personally went to the legislature many, many times. That new 2012 law has been referred to by many as the Bondi Law. Tell us, Attorney General, what is it that we needed in terms of updating our laws, and how is it that our AG's office is pushing that agenda forward?
I'm going to answer your question in a minute, but I want to stress again, this is the most humble man who's moderating this panel. Terry is head of the Advancement for Human Rights at Florida State University. This has been his life's work, not only in our country, but all over the world. All of our ideas, everything we're doing, is working with this guy constantly. So stop being so humble. That's what makes you so special. And we've been working with you, for about 2 years now. And we brainstorm, and all of the ideas, this legislation, wouldn't have been possible without you. So, Terry, thank you. I mean, you truly have championed this. And I feel like today you should feel like a proud father, because everything that you've been talking about for so long is really coming together in our state, thanks to all of our law enforcement and DCF and DJJ and the governor and all of our great agencies. So thank you for that.
My mother thanks you. Let me
now I'll answer your question.
Let me turn the ball right back to you and tell you, so what is the Attorney General's office doing, General Bondi?
I just wanted that caveat, because everything we've been doing has been with the advice of Terry. In 2012, we worked very hard through the legislative session. We know that we have incredible federal prosecutors like Stacey, and we have great state attorneys from Kathy Rundle, Mark Oberheer, Bernie McCabe, all the way up through the Panhandle. I could name all 20 of them, and they are doing a great job too. But our statewide prosecutors, because some of these cases cross county lines, so we went in and we asked the legislature for authority to do wiretaps, to have wiretap authority, and we worked very closely with FDLE and other agencies on that. We also combined Florida's 3 existing human trafficking statutes into one statute, which makes it much more user-friendly for law enforcement. That sounds minor, but not if you're a law enforcement officer. You need to be able to find it quickly, and that was important to us. We also have enhancements for the offenders, and so we're really proud of that law, and we're working hard to implement it each and every day.
Thank you, General Bondi. And the Polaris reports that annually ranks every state across the country for how effectively they're responding to trafficking from the perspective of their laws actually gives Florida our highest ranking. And in large part it is because of the continuing efforts to go back to the legislature repeatedly and say, this is what we've learned. This is the gap that we realize we now have. We've been doing this since 2004, but it's really since 2012 with the Bondi bill. And again, these are laws that pass unanimously. It's a great tribute to our legislature that no one is in favor of trafficking on either side of the political aisle. We pass these laws unanimously, and they have the support of the Florida public, which of course they should have. If we look at this from a law enforcement perspective, we see it's very, very important. One of the challenging things about trafficking cases is that they cross city lines, they cross county lines, state lines, and actually international boundaries as well. And as a result, they are very, very challenging for law enforcement to pursue. It's why we need state, local, and federal law enforcement working together. We have great partners with FBI, with FDLE, with the Department of Homeland Security, working together on these cases. If I could ask, especially Commissioner Bailey, FDLE has done leading work, and with especially your mandate to work across state and judicial and county lines. What is it that you've done for awareness?
Thank you, Terry. We, as I mentioned before, both in the investigations and forensics area, to start with, we work always in partnership with the sheriffs and the chiefs in the state. And what you'll see is that looks differently in the Tampa Bay area. What we do is what we would do in the Panhandle. There are different levels of expertise and different expectations from local law enforcement around the state. But as I mentioned in the opening remarks, it is primarily a local law enforcement initiative. We render jurisdiction, analytical services, and there's not many of these that go by where one of our 6 crime labs does not get involved in evaluating evidence. The other thing that is becoming more and more active is what we're doing in cybercrime, and some of our cybercrime people are here. They're going to be involved in the breakout sessions. One thing that's happened there, and I guess it's the opposite of empire building, is when General Bondi had taken office, she had a cybercrime unit. FDLE had a cybercrime unit. We had a presence in some parts of the state, but each of our 7 regional areas did not have a cybercrime unit. The assets, resources, and personnel of the Attorney General's cybercrime unit were transferred to FDLE, and with that, we now have each of our 7 regions has a cybercrime unit. We're continuing the effort with especially the children involved cybercrimes, and I can tell you, folks, it is a target-rich environment. There's just a few days go by that we don't make some egregious arrest in having to do with child exploitation. You'll hear more about that here. And the last thing that we do is the data. And I think even among my law enforcement colleagues, that's somewhat unappreciated as to what we're doing there. I mentioned to you uniform crime reports. I don't think any of us here, although we know it's a problem, I don't think we know the breadth and depth of that problem. And when the locals start gathering that information, we will get a better handle. And again, data. There's 2,500 arrests made in our state every day. We currently hold 25 million arrest records in Tallahassee, the records of the sheriffs, the records of the chief. Those are an invaluable tool to go back through those records when one of the detectives in the field, one of the officers on the road is making an arrest, doing an investigation. Those 25 million files are there for them to access to get more information. So you're looking at investigations and forensics, you're looking at data, and you're looking at the training that we had mentioned earlier, that we have both basic recruit and we have the refresher course now online for the officers of the state.
And that's a great new innovation, that, again, a 2-hour course that's been introduced by Commissioner Bailey and by General Bondi for our law enforcement officers all around the state. So even those that didn't get trained at the academy, and that's, again, about 95% of our officers that actually went through the academy prior to the mandatory training that began in 2007. They now have that opportunity to receive the training. So a great step forward for Florida there. It's a tribute, I think, especially to FDLE, the role that they continue to play connecting cases throughout the state. We had a case recently, actually a couple of years ago in Tallahassee, that involved Colombian organized crime, sex traffickers that had brought in young women from about a dozen different Latin American countries, and were actually sending them out, delivering them almost like they were pizzas. It was a delivery brothel service. And FDLE actually were the ones to connect the dots. It was being investigated by the FBI and by our state and local officers in Tallahassee. And FDLE connected the dots and realized the same Colombian organized crime group is operating in Tampa Clearwater and is actually doing the exact same kind of crime there. And again, a great tribute to the role that FDLE plays in actually linking law enforcement agencies and officers from around the state to combat a crime that clearly does not respect judicial boundaries, municipal boundaries, or state boundaries for that matter. So, if we could go back to Secretary Daly. You talked a little bit about the JAC, the JAC systems. Tell us a little bit about those and about the work that you're doing to actually try to identify the trafficking cases that may actually be in those centers that are operated.
Sure. Well, juvenile assessment centers are facilities around the state where law enforcement bring youth when they are arrested. They come in, they get assessed, we call their parents, we figure out if they're going to score for secure detention or just be able to go home with their parents. And so in these three, what we call them JAC assessment centers, we implemented this pilot, and it was basically, we worked with Shared Hope America and took a tool and implemented. We did training with our staff, and it was a wonderful pilot, and we're hoping to see really good data come out of it. It's a definite smart way to identify these youth, and then to ensure that we're putting them in places where they can be safe and get the services that they need.
And that statistic that there's annually at least about 100,000 U.S. citizen children that are at risk it's a stunning kind of statistic that we all have to wrap our heads around. This idea that so many of our own U.S. citizen children are absolutely at risk. Like Telly told us at the beginning of the day, that it's kids that are growing up right here in Florida that find themselves literally vulnerable to this kind of exploitation. The dilemma that those children face, too, is that even after they have been correctly identified and perhaps actually the system starts to appropriately address their needs, one of the huge needs that they've had, and this is our FSU research has run into this time and time again, is that there's so little bed space that's available for these children. If we could ask Secretary Jacobo, what is it that DCF is doing to try to help create bed space for literally these tens of thousands of U.S. citizen children that need this?
Well, at this time we have in terms of the safe houses which are mentioned in the legislation, we don't currently have a short-term safe house in the state of Florida. We do have two providers who have long-term safe house placements and services in Suncoast and the Southeast region, so the Tampa area and the Broward, Palm Beach area. But I will tell you that in terms of capacity for beds, what we have found is that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation in terms of where you place the children. An evaluation of the children is the first step. And sometimes the capacity that needs to be built is not necessarily around bed space for safe houses, but rather in therapeutic foster placements where there is a single child. One of the things that we have found is that sometimes placing the children together increases danger of recruitment by one of the girls to the other girls. So the issue of developing it we've had to get very creative around where we're looking to place the children, and so we need more foster parent volunteers who will understand the challenges of having a child who's been trafficked in their home and be willing to deal with it and trained to deal with it in trauma-informed care. And then also looking for some congregate places that maybe not designated as safe houses, but that have therapeutic settings that are all across the state with our community-based care partners.
And this is one of the fundamental challenges facing not only Florida, but really nationwide, that we have children that are essentially caught up in trauma bonding, that they're in a relationship with a pimp that they think loves them, who is actually brutally exploiting them. And it's one of the ongoing challenges for us here in Florida to think through that, about how do we actually appropriately care for those children, separate them at times physically from that pimp for at least that short period of time that most likely does require some kind of secure kind of home for them to be in. But that remains, I think, an ongoing challenge. It's great to have a brain trust like this here right in front of us. Not that we'll solve this issue today, but will very much be on our radar screens as we go forward. How can we better do this as the state of Florida? One of the concerns that we have, of course, is child sex trafficking. A question for Commissioner Bailey. We hear actually quite a bit about the online stings that are still so necessary because literally we have predators within our population here in Florida. This notion that an adult male who is soliciting a child for a sex act, is that human trafficking?
It probably is, but obviously, when we work in a case like that, we work very closely with the state attorney on the charges, and they go forward with what they're comfortable charging with. To date, I know of only one case that has turned into a human trafficking case that we worked. Generally, the cases are charged under the the laws that deal with child exploitation or child pornography. So under any definition with a coercion that goes with that, it would be, but generally that is not how it is being charged in our state today.
And the great thing now is that both Florida and federal law have really caught up to this question, and that in the same way that a child actually cannot consent to sex, that's why we have statutory rape laws, neither can a child consent to commercial sex, that somehow the exchange of money doesn't somehow make that consensual on the part of the child. So it's great that our statutes are very, very much catching up with the reality that our children cannot consent to either, if you want to call it regular sex, or commercial sex for that matter. And great to see that kind of leadership that's moving forward on that. It's important, of course, that here in Florida that we look not just at sex trafficking, as horrific as many of those cases are, but all the evidence suggests that we have far more labor trafficking cases, and actually far more labor trafficking victims here in Florida as well as around the country. If I could turn to General Bondi, what are some of the efforts that your office is now pushing forward to look at this idea of not just sex trafficking, but labor trafficking as well here in our Sunshine State?
And that's so important, and that's why we're working with law enforcement and developed that 2-hour online toolkit as to what to look for. You can also go on myfloridalegal.com, and we have a toolkit online as to what to look for. Because again, you know, we talk about domestic servitude. We talk about, I'm sorry, I didn't have my microphone on. We talk about domestic servitude. We talk about, you know, and we have a large migrant community, of course, here in the Middle District of Florida. And so I think it's so important for people to know what to look for. And that's when, among our many discussions, we decided that we need the public's help. We cannot do this alone. And so that's why it's so important to confront this on every level, not only the sex trafficking, but the domestic servitude. I met with an FBI agent when I was in Washington, D.C., and he told me a story of a very, very affluent neighborhood in D.C. where it was supposedly a housekeeper, and she was basically held hostage, keeping this very wealthy family's children. And they ended up being charged, I believe. But to hear this FBI agent story, it's just compelling. And none of the neighbors knew what to look for. So that's why our awareness program is so important on so many levels. And again, you know, we just launched, it's called From Instant Message to Instant Nightmare. And please, if you have a business, if you have access to a large email list, we have no pride of ownership, none of us. Take what we have, you cut, you paste it, you use it. We want all of our kids to have this on their computers. We want all of our parents, all of our business communities to be aware of what is happening. And we can't do this alone. And that's why, Terry, your efforts have been just truly amazing, and thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And I think it's so important that we recognize that at times, actually, it's not just law enforcement efforts, but that because this problem is actually a part of our economy here in Florida, that's the way in which we have to address this. And I wonder if we could address a question to Secretary Lawson, the Division of Business and Professional Regulation. We're seeing cases, of course, throughout our economy in Florida, whether it's in hotels or resorts or restaurants, construction sites, nail salons. What's the role that DBPR plays in actually addressing trafficking in that respect here in Florida?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is that we have boots on the ground. You know, I told you earlier, we have 1 million licensees. They range from barbers, cosmetologists, nail techs, hotels, restaurants. And some of these places may hire the wrong people. And if you're licensed by my department, you're required to go through an inspection. And my inspectors and investigators go in maybe twice a year. And while they're in that location, in that tech salon, and they see things that look funny, that gives them a chance to perhaps tell law enforcement, check this place out. But without proper training, they won't know what to identify. And I got to tell, shout out to you, he's come to my department and trained my people. Explain to them what are the indicators of human trafficking. What should we look for? Because when my people are getting trained, they're more effective when they're doing their jobs. In addition to his training, internally, we have training for our people. So constantly, they're being reminded, watch out for these indicators. Because if we have someone who's being trafficked and using illegal labor, that hurts our economy. Sir?
Well, thank you, Secretary. And we understand that because it is a part of our economy here in Florida, that training is really absolutely critical, and that it's actually going to be within our work sites that we will ultimately eradicate this. If I could turn to Director Panuccio, tell us, if you could, a word about how your department actually sees this, or what aspects of our Department of Economic Opportunity actually encounter trafficking.
Well, thank you, Professor Coonan. And first, let me just say, for those who don't know what DEO is and what it does, it was a state agency created 2 years ago to really combine all of our economic policy and program functions. So we do economic development and community development and growth management, but a big piece of what we do is also unemployment services, what we call reemployment, and workforce training and outreach. And it's really in that division of the agency that we would encounter human trafficking issues and specifically labor trafficking issues. So what we're focusing on right now is making sure that our outreach staff at every level is trained to understand the signs. That includes our farm worker outreach program, where you see a great deal of labor trafficking in these forced labor camps that you just can't believe exist in modern day America, but do exist. And also our one-stop centers. Everybody knows that all around in every county in the state you have one-stop centers where you can go for employment services. And all kinds of people go to those centers, but also people who may be marginally employed, have just left employment, and have seen signs of trafficking. And so we're making sure that our staff understands those signs, looks a little bit beyond what may look strange in a certain case, to then be able to report to our partner agencies here. And I should say that's also, it's not just for people who are victims, but for people who may be working around a labor camp and see something strange. They need to go on to our websites and others, onto the Polaris Project, and look at the signs. If you see strange working conditions, people who can't leave, people who owe a large debt, people who have health concerns that don't seem to quite match up, they have inconsistent stories, those are things that everyone needs to be looking at and then reporting either to our agency or one of the others up here.
Certainly, thank you. One of the distinguishing, of course, parts of our economy here in Florida is our agricultural sector. And actually, we have had one of our leading human rights groups in the world, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, based right in South Florida, has played a leading role in actually identifying human trafficking cases within our agricultural sector, and then actually assisting with victims, also assisting law enforcement in actually going after those cases. If I could, though, let me throw this back to Secretary Lawson. A great role that, again, our interagency farm worker focus group plays. Say a word about that and how that combats trafficking.
Well, I'll tell you this. That's important. You know, one thing, we regulate farm labor in the state. And what our inspectors do, when we find a farm laborer, we share with them the hotline number that Jesse houses at his department. And it's important that they know that if you see a problem, have an issue, who to contact. And it shows that we're working together as departments. It's not stovepipe here and there, but we're together as one team across the state of Florida.
Thank you. And if I could ask, what is the role that training should play in your department or in some of the other departments that we have around Florida?
I mean, it's key. I mean, think about it. We all know this is bad. It's awful. I was a federal prosecutor years ago, and I worked some these cases. But if, as a prosecutor, as an investigator, as an agency head, if you don't know what you're looking for, you can go into an institution, it'll just bypass you. And with training from people like you, and also a commitment from an agency head or from down the line, it sends the message that we want our people to be aware, to really not only do their jobs, but go beyond that. Because if we allow this crime to occur and continue in the state of Florida, it hurts us all. Not only the victims, but the citizens in the state, and take money away from those who are licensed and doing the right things.
Absolutely, thank you. And perhaps a final question for General Bondi. One of the initiatives that your office is looking at is how to work with the private sector on actually combating trafficking, knowing that at the end of the day, it's not just about prosecuting it, as important as that can be. What is it that the private sector needs to understand here in Florida about trafficking?
Terry, it's like I said earlier, I'm sorry, if I can digress for one more second. I've been texting, you know, a lot of this is preventative to keep these children from ever having to experience that. And I've been talking to Dottie Berger McKinnon, who is extremely ill. That's no secret, extremely ill. And she has done so much in the arena. Her life has been dedicated to
Joshua House, a kids' place, helping the children's home, helping kids along with the great work of DCF, keeping kids safe so they don't end up in that life on the very front end. And so our prayers have to be with Dottie Berger McKinnon today for everything that she's done for our community and our state. But yeah, it's about educating our businesses and again, spreading the word and working together. And one of the things that we've all been discussing is even law enforcement, I didn't know what to look for in a human trafficking case. So often you can't tell if a victim's being trafficked because we heard from our victim, and they're drugged, they're brainwashed, and they become a part of the captor's lives, where if someone saw you walking down the street, they wouldn't initially know that something was suspicious. But if it is, if you see it, it's all of us learning to look for the signs. And if you see it, report it to law enforcement. It can't hurt to report it. And just to have it looked into. And so that's why the business community, we've been so proud of them for stepping forward and coming to us. And so many of you out there have come to us and say, what can we do to help? And you don't know how much that means to all of us sitting up here today. But it's all about education. Do you agree? And looking for the signs. And is there anything that you can add to that, Terry?
Important just for all of us to keep in the back of our mind our national hotline number, too. That's right. It's a 24/7 number, 1-888-3737-888. It's taken me about 5 years to memorize that number, but I'm happy that I can finally do that. Again, 1-888-3737-888. And what that is, it is a number that is actually 24/7, and if anyone, whether law enforcement, a service provider, someone in the business community, someone in our educational communities here in Florida, if you even suspect that there's a possibility that you may have just seen some indicator of trafficking, you don't have to be sure about it at all. They welcome chancy calls, just that something doesn't look right about this situation, to please call that number, and they will then actually connect the dots. They call local law enforcement. They call the local service providers. They call the FBI if necessary. This idea that, again, there be a central place that we can all call that can then get the word out to local communities.
And Terry, also, we talked about the billboards that are going up. We also have them in poster form, the instant message to instant nightmare. So I've had law enforcement agencies already calling me, contacting me, asking for some of the posters. So we have them in poster form. If you have a business, reach out to us. We would love for you to put them in your break room. We know so many of you have access to thousands of people, and it's getting the word out there, so we'd love to share those posters with you.
Good. Well, thank you, General Bondi. Thanks to actually all of our Florida leadership, this brain trust that's with us here this morning. Thank you for your presence here today, but thank you even more for your ongoing support of these efforts to eradicate modern slavery. We will now take a 15-minute break. Starting at 10:45, we'll have breakout sessions to which you're invited, I believe which you've signed up for, looking at the different complexities of human trafficking here in Florida. Thank you all.